Okay, Fats, you mentioned you got so you're in charge. You've got a team of runners running around Vegas, putting money on for the businessman. Were all these? You said that all the bets were placed in casinos. Was it cash, or did you have a line of credit?
It was all cash. There was a stretch where through somebody that I knew from like that first weekend when I went to Vegas and decided I was going to move to Vegas. Um, there was one casino where I was able to hook up with the sportsbook manager and the guy who handled the credit, and they gave me a credit line of like 15 or 20,000 where I could go to the cage, take the cash out of the cage, place the bets, and then I just would have to pay those markers back right away. But I was able to even use the money to take out the cash and run next door to the next casino and make the bet too. So it was a privilege I had for a little while in one particular casino, but for the most part, it was always all put the cash up and bet.
So the other gamble, apart from the teams that you were backing winning, was that the runners were trustworthy. I understand the businessman had a unique sort of attitude towards runners that stole off of him.
Well, I had a very good track record over the years as far as people stealing, and that was because unlike most crews that had runners, they would give the guy a bankroll, he would make the bets, and they would check a figure every day. Whereas I would meet my runners on a daily basis, give them their bankroll in the morning. They would go off to the casino, make their bets, and then I would collect them and cash them out every day, and then just give them a fresh bank to start each day. So they didn't have the temptation of, if they wanted to play blackjack at 3 o'clock in the morning, they had to use their own money. They didn't have my money to do it. So I had um, a lot of success keeping guys from doing that. But there was a few guys that I gave a little more of a leash to, and those were guys that came originally, were sent out to work, to move to Vegas and work from the businessman or through somebody that we knew well. So a lot of times, I would put a little more trust in those guys. But what would happen is if we had a guy that did something like that, what the businessman would do is he would send that would we'd have to ask the guy to go back to Vegas or go back to Philadelphia, and he would work in the supermarket and pay it off. And after he, proved himself and paid it off, then he would work his way back into the sports betting business again.
You told a story on one of the things I listened to about a guy that said he spent it all on drugs and then said it was your fault for giving me the money, the businessman.
That's a guy. He was a guy that really he had absolutely nothing to do with the sports, but he was a guy that worked in the supermarket. And one of the things that the businessman was really good at is he could take like the worst kind of guy and motivate them and kind of rehabilitate them and show them a little faith and get them. But there was this one guy, his name was Leo, and there was no rehabilitating this guy. This guy was just a stone bad guy. And the businessman had him working in the supermarkets and doing other things for him. And so there was this one situation where he needed to give $5,000 to somebody down in Atlantic City. So he gives the 5,000 to Leo and tells Leo to go meet this guy. Leo says no problem. And then Leo disappears, and we don't see Leo for like a week. And it never shows up. So about a week or so later, we're up in his office above the supermarkets, and he's got Leo there. And he says, Leo, well, what happened? What'd you do with the money? He says, I spent it. So what'd you spend it on? I said, drugs, gambling, whatever I wanted to spend it on. He says, why'd you do that? He says, because I had it. And Mike says, and the businessman's like, well, I don't understand. And Leo says, what don't you understand? First of all, he says, I don't know why are you blaming me? And the businessman says, what are you talking about? And Leo says, you know me. You know better than to give me $5,000. What the hell did you think I was going to do with it? It's your fault. You should have never given it to me. And the businessman says, you know what? You're right. It is my fault. And that was the end of it. Dropped.
You mentioned earlier, you said there are other crews. So how many other crews would there have been in Vegas at that time, for different bosses?
Oh, gosh, there could have been as many as 5 to 10. I mean, Dinky had a crew, and there was um, let's see, Artie had a crew. There was a guy named Davy K had a crew. Billy obviously had his own crew. I mean, that's 5. And then there were other crews out there that maybe were a little smaller or a little more under the radar that were out there. And you didn't always know who they were with, but they were obviously, what's the word for it? A group of some sort or working in coordination with something. They weren't just some guy walking up to the counter and just betting for funds and shits and giggles. So
this many people got organized crews. You assume that they all must be winning, otherwise they'd have disappeared again. So do you think that does that suggest that the bookmakers weren't as smart as the punters generally? It sounds a silly thing to say, but it seems that they would have made a lot of mistakes if that many crews could have made it pay and organize a crew like that.
well, I would have to say no to that because I mean, if you look at the reports that the casinos put out from month to month, you never see them put out a month where they lost on sports betting, or I mean, so they were still winning, and there were a lot of times when the casinos needed the help of the sharp guys because the public would be so heavy on a game, they just kept betting, and we would be the only ones that would buy back the other side because we felt that they drove the line too far. So, really, a smart bookmaker just writes a bet, moves the line, continues to write like Circus Sports does now in Vegas. They're like setting this gold standard for the way bookmaking used to be and the way it should still be.
So there was not a situation then where one of your men would go into the casino and they'd say, "I'll leave me out. You're sticking on for the businessman. He's too clever for us," because there was enough public money to cover what you guys were winning.
Oh no, they would still throw us out all the time. They would try to throw you out, and then you just send a new guy in, and he'd last a week or two, and then you would send a new guy in, and then some places would make a rule where you could come in and bet, but you can only come in once a day. Come in once a day, make your bets, and leave. So you had to coordinate it, all kinds of different ways. There would be, because a lot of times you only go to a place because you would have the line service, like at the time it was done best, and the game would be 7 everywhere, and then maybe you see an 8 pops up at this one casino. Well, you want to take the +8, but that's the only thing. So you would go straight there, send somebody over there right away to grab the 8 if you didn't have somebody sitting there already. And so that was kind of some of those rules. So if you went in and you took that 8, then in one of those places where you couldn't send another, that guy couldn't go back in there later in the day and make a bet. So
Okay, so the guys that I spoke to that tipped me up to try and get in contact with you said that you're a legend in the game in Las Vegas, and everybody wanted to be around you at the function you were at. But another person that gets mentioned in revered tones as well is Billy Walters. I assume you meant him when you said Billy earlier on.
Yeah, Billy's group. Yeah, the computer group, Billy Walters. Yes.
And you worked for him after the businessman.
I worked for him after the businessman for 1 year. And then after the year I worked for him, then I went on my own.
Okay, so what sort of work did you do for Billy?
Pretty much the same as I did for the businessman. Billy would call me he would give me a set of outs that were his own personal outs that I would call and bet for him. And I would have my own outs that I would call and bet for him and turn in a percentage. And I would have it because I was working for him. I would turn it in and I would get a free roll on that, on my outs. The year I worked for him, I had nothing to do with the betting in the casinos. I worked strictly out of my office betting private guys. I didn't deal with anything in the casinos. The
You
year I
mentioned he
worked
was
for him.
you mentioned he was at the computer teams. Was he one of the first people to sort of utilize technology to try and get the extra edge? Is that how he made his money?
What he did was that there was a guy that had written a computer program that turned out to be really good at handicapping the games. And the problem was the guy had no clue how to bet. So what would happen is he went out to Vegas to test his program and he was winning. And then what would happen is, so he would want to go around from casino to casino to bet what his games were. But after people realized that this guy is winning, he would go to the first casino, people would see him bet. And then by the time he went to the second casino, somebody would have called ahead and already bet in all his games. As soon as he would bet the first casino, his games would start moving in all the other casinos because people would call ahead. And so he didn't know how to deal with that. And Billy's expertise was dealing with stuff like that and how to organize betting to, account for that. And that was why they made such a good partnership together.
Just as an aside, at the end of this part, you talk about sports betting. Sports betting is your game, and all the people we've talked about. But was betting on horse racing a big thing in the casinos as well in those days? Were there crews doing horse racing?
Every now and then you would get a call. Oh, you got to bet so and so in the fourth at such and such, and I used to hate it when I would get that call because first of all, you would go into the casino and because it was a quote hot horse, what would happen is that if one or two people go in, like let's say the horse is listed as like 10-1 on the morning line, and somebody goes in and says, all right, I want to bet this horse. And then 10 minutes later, another guy comes in and singles out that horse. And you got a whole card and everybody comes in and wants to bet the third horse in the fourth race. And everybody wants to bet it, then the casinos be like, no, we don't want any more of this because they were booking the action themselves. They weren't putting the money into the pari-mutuel pool. Now these days the money goes in right into the pari-mutuel pool, so there's no really casinos don't care. They're getting their 17% or whatever it is they're getting. But back then, the casinos didn't want the exposure. But what I would find amusing was by the time this horse went off, it would go off at like 2-1, and it would never. They never went off at 10-1. They would always, by the time it got around the post time, the horse would go off at 2-1, and then it never would win. So I just used to dread getting those phone calls because people would be like, "Oh, you got to bet this horse." I'd be like, "Yeah, okay." I just couldn't deal with it.
Something